Okay, so I think we'll get started then. So I'll start off first of all. Just want to thank you all for coming along. Tim and I were really blown away by the response to this webinar. We had 100 spots in the Zoom webinar, which is the capacity Zoom gives us, and that was fully booked out in about half an hour of Tim putting it up on social media. So we're really blown away by the response. In the end, we had over 1,000 people register to get a recording of the webinar. And I think it really just shows how passionate this group of people is about finding ways to return athletes and patients back from injury and back from this break caused by the coronavirus. So I think that's something really to be proud of as a group. Just to introduce myself, my name's Heath Gabbett. I run a lot of the business and administrative side of things here at Gabbett Performance, and I'll be just the MC for the session today with Tim. So for those of you who haven't used Zoom before, there's a few features that we'll use today. Mostly just the chat feature would be the main one. Lots of questions throughout the session, lots of opportunity to answer those. So if you have any questions, just pop those in the chat box down the bottom. I'll be monitoring that, and I can flag that with Tim when there's any sort of relevant questions popping up, and Tim can answer those throughout. We'll also have some time for questions at the end. So feel free to send those in the chat during the session, or you can save them for the end. It's up to you there. So today, Tim's going to be looking at return to sport, both in terms of a general context, so generally returning from injuries, but also with a specific focus on what's going on right now, and that's the forced suspension of sporting seasons due to the coronavirus outbreak, and how athletes can return to sport in a professional context following such a long time away from sport. So I think without further ado, I'll hand over to Tim and we can get started.
Thanks very much, Heath, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. It means a lot to me to have worked with many of you over the last few years. You've been a great support of the message that I've been trying to get out to people, that training is a good thing, that training hard is a good thing, and that we can actually train our athletes and our patients harder to develop physical resilience and to develop mental resilience. So I appreciate the support you've given me over a long period of time. And this webinar is kind of a very small way of returning the favour, and hopefully giving a little bit back to you. Hopefully it helps you a little bit, put your mind at ease about bringing your athletes back from this enforced break. So the things that we'll cover over, let me see if I can get this moving. The things that we'll cover over the next hour or so, there's three main topics that I'd like to cover. The first is this concept of building resilience, and I've heard a lot of people have contacted me, and there's been a mad rush, I guess, to try and organise structure for our athletes. How people are dealing with this lockdown in different ways. For those that have met me along the way, you'll know that I'm more of a glass half full person than a glass half empty person. So can we use this situation that we're in at the moment to actually come out of it stronger? And through this, I want to talk about how we can load from home, how we can keep our chronic load up. And of course, we're going to have to be flexible, and we're going to have to be adaptable about the way we achieve load. And then the final part of this webinar is the actual return to sport component of it. How do we make sure that when we do return our athletes to competition, that they can hit the ground running when they return? Now, there'll be natural breaks throughout the webinar. So I'll basically break this into three sections, and then there'll be some natural breaks where we've built in some question time as well, and I'll answer some of the questions that have come through. There's been some common themes that have come through from the different questions. And please feel free to send through any questions that you have through the chat through the chat function, and Heath will highlight those along the way as well. So if we start off with this concept of building resilience, what I want you to first do, and this might seem a little strange if you're expecting this just to be a training related seminar. But what I want you to do is think about, just take 20 seconds, 30 seconds to think about or to write down the toughest thing that you've had to endure in your life. Now, this could be from the moment you were born to today. Think about the hardships that you've had throughout your life, whether it be financial difficulties, whether you've had injuries, whether you've had difficulties in the workplace or relationship troubles or challenges that you've had to deal with in your life. Just take 10, 15 seconds to deal about that, to think about that. You won't have to think too hard. All of us have gone through some sort of hardship. Now, what I want you to try and do is just hold that moment in your head as we go through the rest of the session, and it will make a little bit more sense why I've asked you to do this as we move through. If we think about hardship, we can think about hardship in one of two ways, or we can think about trauma in one of two ways. We can look at it as we are a victim. We can look at it as, why do these things always happen to me? And we get these hardships that occur over and over again in our life, and when they come up, our mindset is, why me? Why does this always happen to me? Or we can look at it as an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to develop some sort of resilience. Now, the reason I bring this up is that there is some good evidence that hardship, adversity, gives you the opportunity to develop resilience. There's a paper that, for those of you who are interested in it, which basically revolves around the concept of why talent needs trauma. Now, if you think of the way that we set up our high performance setups, whether it be in pro sport, whether it be in college or high school environments, where we set up these high performance environments, we tend to set up environments that are almost perfect conditions for our athletes. We set up the best and the most extensive training facilities. We surround them with the best coaches and the best support staff. We provide food for them. We provide schedules for them. We provide athletic trainers and physical therapists and massage therapists to look after their every need. We tell them where to be and at what time to be there. The idea of the concept behind why talent needs trauma is that even though we've set up these perfect conditions, there's a school of thought that talent might actually need some trauma. They might have to overcome some adversity to actually get to the top of their game. And this is a really key concept in developing resilience, that this moment that we've got where we're in lockdown at the moment, we can look at it as, this is a real challenge for us. It's a real problem for us. We can't train as much as we'd like. We've lost contact with our athletes. Or we can look at it as a way to develop some more skills. We can look at it as a way as we can develop an adaptable and a flexible athlete, someone who is resilient to little traumas and hardships that come along the way. So we may actually need this hardship to promote something in our athletes that they haven't got at the moment. We can use it in that way. We can still maintain loading. We can find ways to load, and we can find ways to be mentally resilient. And what I'm trying to say here is that rather than avoid this hardship, it's kind of like training load. We can look at training load as in one of two ways. We can avoid it, and then we will never get a training load related injury, or we can push towards it. We can embrace it, and then by embracing training load, it gives us the chance to be better able to tolerate training and better able to tolerate load. So if we look to this hardship and this moment where we're going through a bit of a tough patch, we can try and avoid it, or we can embrace the hardship and try and develop something that we didn't realise we were going to get. Now I want you to think back to that moment where I asked you to write down the toughest thing that you've gone through in your life, or to think about that toughest moment that you went through in your life. Now, at the time, it probably seemed impossible. You're in the pit. You're in a very dark place and you're thinking, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. You're probably thinking, I want to give in. I want to get out of this. But every one of you on this call who have gone through hardships found a way to get to this point where you are today. So now I want you to contrast where you were when you're in that pit, when you're in the hardest part, or the worst hardship that you've ever gone through, and think about where you are today. And for most of you, it will be chalk and cheese. It will be, I'm a long way away from where I was when I was in that hole. Now, the point I want to emphasize here is this is a really good example of the hardship that you've overcome in your life. You've found a way to work through that moment, and as a result, you've become either physically or mentally stronger. So these moments occur throughout our life all of the time, and this is just another moment that will come and go. There's a little saying, this too shall pass. This is exactly what we're experiencing with the coronavirus. Yes, we're going through a bit of a tough spot at the moment, but we will come out the other side of it and we will adapt and we will be stronger as a result. What I'd like you to try and do when you're feeling like you can't get through some of these moments, think about some of the places that you've been before. Think about some of the hardships that you've overcome, and those hardships that you've overcome have allowed you to become resilient, they've allowed you to become adaptable, and they've prepared you for this exact challenge that we're in right now. So you can draw on that resilience that you've developed over the years of your life, and you can use it to succeed post-COVID. So when we're talking about resilience today, what I'm talking about it in terms of it will require a general response. But then as we get closer to sport, it will require a more specific response. So when we talk about specific issues, we'll be talking about things like the time that an athlete is away from their sport. But when we talk about resilience, what I'm talking about is learning from this situation, adapting and remaining confident that you've got the skills to work your way through it. Everyone on this call has the ability to work their way through this challenge that we're in at the moment, and they can find a solution to this challenge. With our athletes, they're going to be experiencing a whole heap of emotions at the moment. I really do believe that you don't just wake up one day and you're resilient. You don't just wake up one day and you've got a mental strength that can overcome any adversity. That resilience comes from adversity. If you put your athletes in these tough situations and you give them an opportunity to problem solve their way through it, then it gives them a chance to develop flexible and adaptable skills. It gives them a chance to develop resilience. So this is an opportunity for them to get better. Encourage them to get better through this situation. Now, this could be in a number of different ways. It could be physically. There could be limitations that they have physically. This is an opportunity to work on those limitations. Use it as an opportunity that this is time that you don't want to lose. This is time that you will never get back. You will never have a better opportunity to get better at something. Okay, we're talking about athletes now, but I'm also thinking about it in terms of coaching staff. And when I say coaching staff, I mean everyone from sports coaches, physical therapists, athletic trainers, strength and conditioning specialists, front office staff. This is your opportunity to get better. Now, I've had a lot of people kind of contact me worried about what this enforced lockdown poses, what will happen on the back of this. As a coach or as a support staff, you want your athletes to maintain composure under pressure. You want them in the most demanding aspect of play, whether it be physically or mentally. You want them to show their skills. You want them to show their robustness, both physically and mentally. This is an opportunity for you as coaches and support staff to model that behavior. So if you're a little unsure or you're panicking about the situation, then probably what you'll find is your athletes will reflect that behavior. But if you're calm about the process, if you're looking at this is just one obstacle that we can overcome and we can get through it together and we can solve it, and you're calm about that process, I can almost guarantee you this will be reflected in your athletes. They will take on a lot of that calmness that comes with it. Now, just as it's an opportunity for athletes to get better, and they can use any number of ways to improve their academic skills, their mental skills, their physical resilience, I would really encourage coaches to do the same, coaches and support staff. This is an opportunity for self-reflection. This is time that you never, ever get. At any other time of your career, will you have a better opportunity to develop you as a person or as a coach. So be critical. You only have to share it with yourself, but look inside yourself and say, is there something that I need to do to improve myself personally or improve myself professionally? Now, this could be any number of things. Maybe it's an opportunity for you to get physically fit yourself. Maybe it's time that you don't normally have to do some training yourself. You can come back and be in better shape than when you left. You can be stronger than when you left. Maybe it's an opportunity if you want to learn more about planning, you want to learn more about training load and how to develop effective training plans and training programs. There's no better opportunity to upskill in that area. And there's a whole range of webinars and podcasts and Instagram lives that are ongoing at the moment. You'll never get a better opportunity to do education than now. So take the opportunity to get better. Whatever it is that you think you can improve on, look inside yourself, be honest with yourself and say, this is something that I want to work on. Take the chance to come out of this thing stronger. Stronger physically, stronger mentally, whatever it is that you need to work on, take the chance to come out of this challenge in a better situation than you went into it. So in terms of building resilience, there's a couple of questions that have come through, and I might just do these in reverse order. One of the first questions that came through was, what should our main focus be during the time off? I've thought a lot about this, and I've seen different approaches. When COVID first came on the scene and everyone went into lockdown, there was mad scrambling. Everyone was trying to get their programs up and running, keep their athletes loading, find ways that they could load. They were emptying the weight rooms out of our training facilities. People were turning up in big trucks to take benches and squat racks away. But it wasn't the initial 2 minutes of the lockdown that was the issue. It was the next 2 weeks that I think was the major challenge, because once the 2 weeks rolled over and we realised that this is going to be a bit of a long haul, we started to see some changes in our athletes. And those changes that we saw in our athletes were just a reflection of what everyone else was experiencing in society. Now, the biggest thing that we need to focus on during this time off is the person. We can all write a program. Any person can put a program on a whiteboard. Any person can come up with sets and reps and some exercises for an athlete. But it takes a special person to work out what makes an athlete tick. That's when you become more of a coach and less of a gym instructor, or less of someone who can write a program on a board. So what I'm suggesting, the first thing we should be doing when in this time off is making sure our athletes are okay, making sure that they're happy. If they're happy, that's going to be a significant hurdle that we overcome. And in terms of getting over the psychological barriers with returning to sport, if you think about it, different athletes are going to be coming in with, they're going to be experiencing different emotions. Some of our athletes are very laid back and they'll just take all this in their stride. They'll take it as a rest, or they'll take it as an opportunity to do something that they wouldn't normally do. Others, on the other hand, will be quite apprehensive. Some will be anxious because they don't have the social interaction that they normally have. Some will be anxious because they don't have the routine that they normally have. And some will be anxious because they don't, they're going to be unsure of whether they're going to be prepared for the season when the season actually kicks off. So when we think about the psychological barriers, or when we talk about loading at home, the first thing I'd recommend is look after the person. You coach athletes, you coach people, you don't coach sets and reps. So look after the athlete, look after the person first. Then once they know that you've got their best interest at heart, then we can start thinking about the loading from home. So when I think about this loading at home challenge, there's a few challenges that come immediately to mind, and it's a really interesting one, because one of the first questions that I get asked when I meet people, when I go into sporting organisations, one of the first questions I get asked is, who has the best facility? What's the best facility that you've seen? And it's kind of a funny question, because all facilities are alike after a while. You go into enough facilities and they all look very similar. And generally what you find is the richer the organisation, the better the facility. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you've got the best training going on. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've got the best culture going on. So what I typically recommend when people ask that question is, I say, look, go out and find one of the poorest clubs, the poorest teams that you can find. And you will find a facility that isn't very flash, but you will find people who are doing the things that matter. They are concentrating on the things that they cannot do without. And the things that they can't do without is a solid work ethic. They need players to work hard for each other. They need a good program, and they need their staff working together. So the challenges that we're facing at home is we don't have the best facilities available anymore. So all of the toys and the equipment and that we're used to dealing with, we don't have that anymore. So we've got non-existent facilities sometimes at home. We've got a lot more excuses available to athletes now that stop from training hard. And it's very difficult to monitor athletes with this inconsistent training access. I know in American sports that there's rules around monitoring athletes, and we've got similar rules in Australia. So we've got to overcome some of these challenges. How do we know that our athletes are doing what we ask them to do? How do we ensure that they're hitting the chronic load that we need them to hit when they do come back to training? How do we know that they're actually doing anything at all? Well, a lot of these things we can't control. A lot of these things we've just got to do our best. So again, I would try and not worry about the things we can't control. And of course, there's more to training than just the physical component of training as well. We've got athletes who mentally will be up and down. Some will be better than others, but you don't have to think too hard with the athletes that you work with, that some will cope with this social isolation better than others. So mental health has to be a priority. That some of them are going to be stressed about when the shutdown will end, and others are really going to be concerned about am I going to be prepared for pre-season training, or am I going to be prepared for the season when it rolls around? So before you can even think about ramping up the program, before you can even think about putting a physical program in place to build robustness, the first thing you need to do before you can build someone up is you need to calm them down. And what I'm talking about here is the brain component of it. Every time we train our athlete physically, we're training the brain to go to places that they haven't been before. But we also know that adaptation to training is not only based on the sets and reps that we give someone, it's based on stress, how we manage our stress, it's based on sleep, it's based on a whole heap of other factors that are related to psychological and sociological stress. So if we can calm that down, it gives us a chance to building a loading plan. So what I really want you to do throughout this period is think beyond the numbers. There is no situation exactly like what we're going through at the moment. So you're going to have to think past the numbers, think past the textbook. Remember that this is a difficult period for the people involved. And just make sure your athlete is okay mentally, calm them down before you ramp up their load. So this is a good opportunity for us as practitioners to use our basic fundamental skills. And we can use creativity and innovation while emphasizing the fundamentals. So still rely on your principles of training, but some of the things that you're going to have to keep in your mind when you're building the athlete is don't sink energy into things that you can't control. Don't worry about things that may never happen. Now, this is something that I would recommend at any point in time, but particularly now, if you can't control it, don't worry about it. Think about the things that you can do rather than worrying about the things that you can't do. What I'd encourage you to do is think laterally. So if you can't get in a squat rack, yes, you may not be able to put 200 pounds on your back and squat it, but there's always ways that you can load. So think laterally. Be creative. Keep touching in with your athletes occasionally. Just send them a message from time to time. We'll have a regular catch up for a short period of time, but it doesn't have to be a really formal meeting. Just touch base with them, make sure they're okay, give your athletes some direction, but then allow them to take ownership of the process. One of the things that we're always complaining about is that our athletes make poor decisions, or they can't make a decision for themselves. They always need to be directed by someone. They can't do anything self-directed. Well, this is an opportunity for us to develop those skills. Give them a little bit of direction and then allow them to take ownership over their performances. Okay, so I've put this one up as a little example of some of the things that I've been trying to do myself to be creative, to be innovative. But these pictures are as much about maintaining physical load for me. Part of it is maintaining physical load, but a big part of it is just keeping my head straight. So if I'm feeling certain emotions during lockdown and during isolation, I can guarantee you that your athletes are feeling the same way. Now, there's the physical component. We know that loading allows you to cope with load. It improves your ability to tolerate load. So there's a physical robustness that comes with loading. But what is the first thing that your doctor would say to you if you went to him and said, I'm feeling stressed or I'm feeling anxious? One of the first things he will say to you is, are you getting enough exercise? So not only are we building a physical resilience in our athletes by helping them load, we're also encouraging mental health. So be creative with your programs. There's heaps of ways that you can find load. Just look around your yard and there's things that you can do. I've been throwing big tractor tyres around. I've been digging holes in the garden for no particular reason other than digging holes. And we've even pushed cars up and down the street. And you'd be surprised that the transfer that you get from some of these activities, they're very similar to the type of activities you do in the weight room. We may not be swinging an axe around or a pick around in the weight room, but those rotational movements are very specific to what we do in a lot of our sports. We may not be pushing cars in our sports, but the leg workout that you get from something like that is not that dissimilar to what you would get from a heavy squat session. We're still looking at triple extension type movements. So take the opportunity to be creative. There's different ways that you can load, and you're really only limited by your imagination here. And encourage your athletes to be creative here. The more creative they can be, the more fun they'll have doing it. Okay, so we're at the end of session 2 here, loading from home. So I thought I would address some of the questions relating to loading from home. So a lot of the questions relate to, well, if we can't monitor our athletes, how do we know that they've done enough? Well, there are some ways that we can monitor them. We can use session RPE to get a gauge on how much load they're using, how much load they're actually doing. Now, if we're not allowed to ask them these questions, then we're going to have to develop a trust with our athletes, and we do that anyway. That's got to be number one part of our job. We've got to train the person rather than the number. So if you're touching base with your athlete, if you've got a relationship with that athlete where it's based on trust, that you trust them to do the work and they trust you to look after them, then you don't have to worry so much about that. They will be doing something. And I can almost guarantee you that the situation that we find ourselves in now is a little bit different from our standard off-season. In our standard off-season, there's always someone that doesn't load. I would almost guarantee everyone will be doing some loading here because they're so bored. They're just trying to find something to do. So they will be doing something. So let's address some of the questions around high intensity training. So one of the questions I got was, well, how do you make sure that you maintain high speed running ability and high intensity running ability during this period? Now, different countries have different requirements during lockdown. In Australia, we're allowed to go to a park as long as we're socially isolated and that there's only 2 of us together at a time and we keep our distance. So we can still do our high intensity running sessions or our high speed running sessions. Now, prior to me getting out of lockdown myself, I wasn't allowed to leave my house for a 2-week period when I returned from Europe. So in that period, the only training I could do was in my house or in my front yard. Now I've got a 19 metre or roughly a 15 yard, 20 yard space. What I was able to do was some MAS sessions, some maximum aerobic speed sessions, high intensity. I may not have reached high velocities, but I could do high intensity running in that space to try and keep my load up. There's lots of ways that you can be creative around maintaining high intensity running. And you'd be surprised how many changes of direction you can get in one of those sessions that involves a 20-yard distance. So I would have said I did more changes of direction in that one session than I would have done in my whole career. But it allows you to keep your load. Now, in terms of how many high intensity sessions you can do when you come back, well, it's really going to depend on your athletes. So one of the principles of training that we use is progressive overload, but another one is individualization. So if your athlete hasn't done any high intensity work, then you're going to have to find a way to build chronic load to allow them to do high intensity work. If they've been doing some high intensity sessions, then the number of high intensity sessions you can do in a week is really dependent on where they've been, how much they've actually done, and where they're going, how much they need to do. In general, I would recommend, if we're doing high intensity running sessions, that, and they're super maximal intensity sessions, then in general, I would suggest that you need at least 2 days recovery, 48 hours recovery, but more likely you will need 72 hours recovery between those high intensity running sessions. So that means that if you run high intensity on Tuesday, the earliest you could probably go back is on a Friday. Now that doesn't mean you can't do other high intensity sessions around that. You can still do your weight sessions, you can still do upper body sessions, you can still do skill sessions. If we were to look at preparing for the worst case scenario, the most demanding passage of play, there's a question around here about worrying about injury risk. The way you prepare for the most demanding passage of play is exactly the same as you would prepare for any other skill or physical quality. You find out where your athlete is at that point in time. What is their floor? Where are they? What are they able to do at the moment? And then what do they need to do as part of their sport? Now, if it's a basketball worst case scenario, then perhaps you've got some running involved, you've got some jumping, some change of direction, and some short recovery periods between that. It might only be a 10-second effort. Now, there's different ways that you can prepare for the most demanding passage of play. You can simulate that or stimulate that that activity over and over again, or you can find out what factors are limiting that most demanding passage of play for that particular athlete. So it could be aerobic fitness that you need to work on more for an athlete. You need to work on strength for some athletes. Maybe it's just general movement qualities where they need to be able to change direction often and as efficiently as possible. So there's always going to be physical qualities that underpin your ability to perform the most demanding passages of play. And the idea is just to try and raise the floor as much as you can to improve your ability to perform those worst case scenarios. I'll just throw to Heath for a second. I think there might be a couple of questions that have come through.
Yeah, so we've received a couple sent in. So I'll address the first one first, was from Kiara. Tim, you were talking about the running you could do in your backyard. Obviously, a lot of people aren't so lucky to have a full backyard. If they live in an apartment, for example, they might not have anything at all. Do you have any ideas for the types of training you can do in the context where you have, little to no space available for those sort of activities?
Yeah, well, I'm assuming in this example that you're not allowed to leave the house at all. So if you're not allowed to leave the house at all, then think about some of the things that you can do in your apartment. Now, there's a lot of loading activities that you can do, a lot of leg activities, lower body activities that you can do in your apartment, from anything from bodyweight squats, split squats, Bulgarians. You can do squat jumps. You can do hamstring work against your wall. You can do hamstring run. You can do running against your wall. So lying on your back and in a supine bridge position and actually doing some hamstring work, some running activity. Now, I've heard in France, in Europe, that some people are allowed to leave their apartment, but they're only allowed to leave by 50 metres. So they can't go any further away than 50-metre distance. Now, in this case, I think this is an ideal opportunity that you can if you need to do high-speed running or sprinting, for a team sport athlete, you can definitely hit top speed between a 30 and 40-metre distance. So there's an opportunity to do high-intensity work there. If you need to do high-intensity conditioning, then a 50-metre distance is perfect. You can do different set durations. You can work on a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 work-rest ratio in a 50-metre distance. You can get some solid high-speed conditioning, high-intensity conditioning scenarios in there. Every different person has a unique situation. As I said, in Australia, we're lucky that we can go to a park to do some exercise, to do some training before we have to get back home. Some people aren't that fortunate. Again, what I'm trying to, and I can't address every specific scenario, but try not to focus on what you can't do. Try and focus on what you can do. Now, obviously, there's going to be some extreme situations where if you've got an apartment with no space, then there's going to be a lot of things that you can't do, and there's a lot of things that where you won't be able to replicate what you can do in normal practice. Don't focus on that. Don't focus on what you can't do. Focus on just maintaining as much load as you can without putting in too much junk. So if you can get some leg sessions in with some split squats or some split jumps or some jump squats, then this is going to be better than doing nothing. So focus on, try and stay glass half full rather than glass half empty. Was there another question there, Heath?
Yeah, we've got a couple more. If we don't answer all of them right now, we can come back to them at the end as well. This next one we'll do now, and then let me know if you'd like to take a third one now or at the end. Sean asked this one, which I think is a really good one for now. Sean's asking how you might go about progressing contact loads for sports like rugby or maybe American football, where you've got a lot of contact. How would you go about replicating that in an indoor environment at home, given, that might be quite difficult to replicate, and also you might have a pretty short rebuilding period for that sort of load before you return to competition?
Yeah, look, this is a challenge that's going to be facing a lot of our collision sport athletes. And one of the things we do know about, we've done some work previously where we had micro technology. Micro were able to count the number of collisions that our athletes performed, both in pre-season and throughout the entire competitive season. And across the entire season, they had around about 2,000 collisions, 1,000 in pre-season, 1,000 in season. But the injury rate was twice as high. It was double in pre-season. Okay, despite the fact they had similar numbers of collisions, the injury rate was double in pre-season. So what that suggests is a couple of things. When you come back from off-season, potentially you decondition, you detrain your ability to tolerate collisions, similar to your ability to tolerate high-speed running. It's something that has to be trained, and it can detrain when you stop doing it. And the second thing it probably suggests is that you probably need to periodise or progress contact loads very similar to how you would progress running loads. You systematically build to the higher loads that you need to do in season. Now, I guess the challenging part there is finding ways to keep some contact load when you're loading from home. Now, if you've got someone where, as a training partner, now I don't know whether this contravenes the isolation rules, but if you can do some light pummeling, that's an option. In American football, with you're blocking for your bigger players, your bigger linemen, is you can practice that up against the wall. You can practice those skills, the speed and the blocking movements, without having a partner in place. As you get from lockdown into return to training, then be thinking about how do I systematically build to these higher loads. So all you need to be thinking about is what does the end goal look like? What does the actual skill look like when we need to do it in competition? And you need to be able to progress in a systematic way to that, but then work back from that. work back from, well, how do I regress this? How do I take this and make it into a skill that's in its simplest form that involves either low intensity or low complexity? Now, if you can do that, it might just be some light pummeling to start with a partner. And as you progress through that, you build slowly across the course of a week or across the course of a number of weeks, where you factor in higher intensity and recovery sessions in between to allow you to slowly build to the chronic loads that you need to get as part of your sport. So slowly you build in some volume, you build in some intensity, and you build in a little bit more task complexity into your training. And hopefully you get to a point where they're able to tolerate the demands that they have as part of their sport. Now, the last question I'll answer on this screen, and we can always come back to these questions, but this question came from a chiropractor when loading inactive patients. How do I find their floor, ceiling, and progress load? So the first thing you need to know for an inactive patient is, well, what is their ceiling? And essentially when I talk about a ceiling, I talk about the task that they need to be able to do, the athletic task they need to be able to do as part of their job. And it could be as simple as, I am a grandfather or a grandmother, and I need to walk up 3 flights of stairs carrying 2 bags of groceries. That is my athletic task. But at the moment, I'm flat out getting off the couch, getting off the lounge. So there is your idea of the floor and the ceiling, and you can assess the tissue specific floor that you've got in your athlete, or the sport specific floor. Now the trick then is, once you know the floor and the ceiling, you just need to work out the time that you've got to get from point A to point B. Now the second question is, well what about progressive loading? When do I ever stop? Well, this kind of depends on your athlete a little bit. If you have grandma and she's getting up those 3 flights of stairs now, and she's doing it comfortably, and she no longer has to lie down on the couch for 3 hours after walking up those stairs, then you're achieving the goal. But maybe she wants to get to a point where she can walk up those 3 flights of stairs, and if she has to go back to the grocery store again and do it again the second time for the day, that she can do it. So the task, that ceiling is an adjustable ceiling. It can adjust depending on where you would like that athlete to get to. And is there a point where you would ever stop loading? Well, realistically, we've only got 24 hours, 7 days a week. So that's the ultimate ceiling. And it's probably unrealistic to aim for that. So there is a point where if you want to increase capacity further, you're not going to get it through increases in load. And in those situations, you're probably going to have to think about recovery, stress, sleep. Are we putting these factors in place to try and prop up capacity in the back end? I'll keep moving through here, and we can come back to some questions at the end as well. The final piece of this puzzle, or the final part of this webinar, is the return to sport component. So we've talked about developing resilience and using this period as an opportunity to get better. We've talked about loading from home and making sure that not only are we thinking about physical load, but we're thinking about the person involved. We're looking after the person. Now, the final part of this is returning to sport. Now, we've already sort of mentioned the floor and the ceiling and time. Now, what I've put this up graphically to kind of illustrate some concepts. When we're building programs, these are 3 concepts that we need to keep in mind. We need to establish the athlete's floor. What I mean by that is, what is their current capacity? We need to know the ceiling. Where do we need to get them to? What do they need to do as part of their job, as part of their athletic endeavors, the athletic task they need to complete? And then the final thing we need to know is time. How much time do we have to get them from the floor to the ceiling and get them there in in one piece. Now that's our base case. We can split this up into some negative scenarios though. If we don't have enough time, if we rush from the floor to the ceiling and try and rush our athletes back, then what happens there is that slope of the line increases dramatically. And two things happen in these scenarios, and we know this happens. One is it increases injury risk. But the second thing that we're starting to realize is that when we ramp up our loads too quickly, then it potentially leaves our athletes underprepared for what they're required to do, and their performance suffers. So there's two things. There's increased risk of injury, but the bigger one is that our performance may suffer. Now, the second negative scenario down in number C there, or letter C, is no matter how hard we try with our athletes during this period to maintain a minimum floor or a minimum chronic load, there's going to be some athletes that will come back deconditioned. So that floor, that should be a good floor, looks more like the basement. Now you can see when we're trying to bring someone out of the basement and we're trying to bring them back to the same ceiling, then the slope of the line goes up again. So we're into that same situation where we're at risk of injury and at risk of underperformance. Now, there's two ways that we can address this. One is that we can artificially buy time. So if our normal start of the pre-season is in the black bar, then we can start loading earlier. We've artificially increased the length of our pre-season. The other way that we can try and achieve a positive scenario is that we raise the floor. Now, by raising the floor, it bridges the gap between our current capacity and the required capacity. So it's much easier to get from the floor to the ceiling. If I could recommend two things for you to do for your athletes, is use the time you've got. This is an opportunity that you will never have any other time in your sporting lives. Use the opportunity to buy time. By buying time, it allows you to raise the floor. You get two positive outcomes. You get more time and you raise the current capacity. Now, the issue we've got at the moment is we've got an idea of the floor. Some athletes will train, some won't, but we'll have an idea that they'll come back with a certain capacity. The demands of the sport won't change. They're still going to be pretty tough. If you're in an MLB season, you've still got to play a lot of games in a short period of time. The one thing we don't know, though, is the time component of this challenge. It's like the analogy I would use is that you're prepared for a race, but you're waiting for the gun to go off. You're just waiting at the starting line. When are we allowed to get started? And the other thing we don't know is how long is this race? We don't know where the finish line is. So these are the challenges we've got at the moment. The time component makes it hard for us to periodize anything. But the best way that we can deal with not knowing the time, that uncertainty around time, is by raising the floor. If we have a good floor, if we just keep our load ticking over, then it gives us the best chance of getting to the ceiling as safely as possible, as quickly as possible, and maintaining a high level of performance. Okay, so just to give you an idea of how we're starting to look at this is a simulator that we've built, a load simulator that we've built that we use as part of our face-to-face and our online workshops. So what it allows us to do is simulate the floor that we would like our athletes to aim for, the capacity that we would like our athletes to start at. It allows us to identify a realistic target load and also look at different scenarios, whether we need to start preparing earlier and how all of that impacts on our weekly load. So I'll just share the screen and show you how this works. Okay, so we've got the, hopefully you can see the spreadsheet in front of you there. So what I've done is set up a situation that might be relevant to a college sport. Let's say that we've got the current floor is around 800, sorry, not 800, 8 hours of training. So that works out to be around 480 minutes of training. So I've rounded that up to 500. That's our floor. We want to get that athlete to 20 hours of training. So that's 1,000 minutes of training in a week. So we're going to go from 480 minutes up to 1,000 minutes, and we've got a 2-week period to do that. Now, if we have the current capacity, the required capacity, and we're going to increase from 480 or 500 to 1,000 in a 2-week period, that's a 41% increase in load across those 2 weeks. So what if we change the scenario a little bit, focusing on our floor, ceiling, and time concept? Let's use a slightly different floor now. Let's say that rather than our athletes starting at 8 hours of training per week, we're going to just increase that by 20%. So they're going to have rather than have 500 minutes of training, they're going to have 600 minutes of training. And rather than give them a 2-week period to build up their load, we're going to give them 4 weeks. So we're asking them to maintain some load while they're loading at home. So we're just increasing that by 2 weeks. So our ceiling hasn't changed, the loads of the sport hasn't changed. All we've changed is we've raised the floor and we've given them a little bit more time of loading. Those numbers change dramatically. We've decreased them significantly. We've gone from 41% increase in load over a 2-week period, and now we're looking at some load towards the ceiling. We're doing it in a much safer way, and we haven't changed anything significantly here. All we've done is bought some more time, and we've made a subtle increase in the floor. So this is just a simple way that you can start planning your return to sport process, your return to training process for your athletes. You can do it in a safe way that maximizes your chances of performance improvements, and when they get to the season, they're performing well, but you get the added benefit of minimizing their injury risk. Now, if you're in your office at the moment, what I'll get you to do is just grab the closest strength and conditioning, physical therapy, athletic training textbook, your go-to textbook when it comes to training. If you're not in your office, that's okay, but most of you will have a textbook close by. What I'll get you to do now is turn to the chapter on dealing with COVID-19. Dealing with pandemics. Okay, if you're a little unsure of that, you might have to go to the glossary, and you go to the glossary or the table of contents section. There is no chapter on dealing with pandemics. There is no chapter on dealing with COVID-19. So we can't expect that what we've been through before is going to be directly translatable to what we're going through now. But what I do know is that the best practitioners won't be relying solely on the textbook now. They're going to have a solid foundation of principles that are going to help them problem solve this situation. Now, when I talk about principles versus rules, we're not talking about the same thing. So if we're talking about rules, we're talking about black and white. You cannot go outside of these rules. They're never to be broken. The 10% rule, for example, would be that you never ever increase your load by more than 10%. And we know that that's an unrealistic expectation, particularly when we're bringing someone back from rehab. Principles, on the other hand, is what you're going to have to develop as a good practitioner, because the rules in this situation do not exist. So you're going to have to use all of the principles of training at your disposal in order to solve your way through this situation. And the principles are fundamentals. They're flexible, they're an adaptable set of fundamentals, but they underpin your training approach. And the number one principle that we're looking at here is progressive overload. It's not the only training principle that we need to consider, though. Progressive overload is one, where we systematically build to higher loads so that our athletes can tolerate the acute demands of competition. But we also need to think about specificity. How can we use the specificity principle as much as we can, as much as possible when we're loading from home, but then build that back into our programs once we return to official training? How do we build recovery into our programs, both physical and mental? How do we individualize our programs so that we can target the factors that are limiting performance, and also individualize our programs for those who have come back with lower chronic loads or higher chronic loads? These are key principles. Think about your training principles, and they will underpin your decision making. They will guide your approach to bringing your athletes back to full performance. Even though this COVID-19 situation is unique, everyone in this call has experienced something similar before. You don't have to look too far to look at the college system. Everyone is saying we need more time. We need a longer preseason. In the pro sports, we typically have an upside down triangle or an upside down pyramid, where the point of that pyramid is our training base, and then we have this massive competition that is supported by a very small training base. We know that the average college preseason is quite short. We know that professional athletes sometimes turn up to training camp out of shape. So even though you've never been through COVID-19 before, you've been through similar situations before. So hold your nerve, think your way through this. You've been in this situation before. Not this exact situation, but you've been in similar situations before. You've handled it before, you will handle it again. There's no need to panic. Stay calm, hold your nerve, think your way through it. The last little point, that if I was to recommend two areas of focus for you while we work our way through this situation. There's a lot of different areas that you can focus on, but still just think back to what are my principles of training and what am I trying to improve. If you're a physical therapist or athletic trainer, you're thinking, how can I improve local tissue capacity? Whether it's an injured athlete or whether it's a healthy athlete, we still need local tissue capacity. But just because we've got local tissue capacity doesn't mean that we're ready to return to sport. We still need to do little touches of sport-specific capacity. So if you can't run, but you've got a stationary ergo, then get on the bike and run. It may not be as specific as running, but find the next best thing. If you can't get on the ice, then you need to find a way to maintain some ability to maintain your ability to skate or your aerobic capacity. So whether it's some side lunging, whether it's some jump side lunges, whatever it is that you need to do to maintain sports-specific capacity, try and do it. Now, just because you have sports-specific capacity doesn't necessarily mean that you're protected against injury. This is where we need our physical therapists and our athletic trainers and our strength and conditioning specialists working together as a team. If you can work together as a team here, you have your medical team building local tissue capacity with injured athletes and doing little reminders of sport-specific capacity. They're still trying to do some sport-specific conditioning. If you have a healthy athlete who's training sport-specific capacity, then you still want to be doing little reminders of local tissue capacity. If you're doing high-speed running, then that doesn't mean that you stop doing your hamstring local tissue work. You still want to be trying to maintain your local tissue capacity. These two things are not isolated. They work hand in hand together. If you can improve local tissue capacity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're ready to return to your sport. Equally, you can have good sport-specific capacity, but poor local tissue health. So keep loading both of these areas. One thing I can guarantee you throughout all of this is, just like before COVID-19, I would recommend you work together as part of a team, part of a sports medicine and performance team. The closer you can work together here, the better chance you've got of keeping your athletes healthy and performing well. The last point I'll make here is, above all else, your athletes will want to come back. They will want to be reassured. They will want to be, you'll need to calm them down a little bit. And the best way that you can calm them down is if you've got a plan and you're all on the same page. That is the one thing that they will want from you. They want a plan. Now, everyone in this call is going to come up with a different plan depending on your situation. But if you have a plan, if you can calmly talk through that plan with your athletes and you can get buy-in, this is our challenge, this is the way we're going to lead you out of it. If you can develop it in that way, I can guarantee you'll get buy-in from your athletes, and that's one of the massive parts of solving this situation, solving this challenge. Get your athletes on board, work together as a team, and think your way out of it. And I can guarantee you that this situation is no different than anything that you've been through before. You can solve this just like you've solved any other of your performance challenges. Okay, so I might leave it there for the actual content component and try and address some of the questions relating to that have come through. And again, if you've got any other questions, feel free to send them through, and Heath will give me a shout out as they come through. One of the questions, if we look at number 2 here, the question was, as a young strength and conditioning coach, I have trouble understanding how to bridge the gap between the theory and the practice. Now, this question relates to, they were reading a lot of the research, and the research said it's inconclusive and more research needs to be conducted. Now, this is a challenge that we're faced with every day, in that there's never going to be the exact research that you need for your situation. And COVID is a really good example of this. There's no research really on COVID and how to train your way out of COVID. But just because there's no research available doesn't mean that you can't use evidence-based practice. Now, evidence-based practice is not just drawing on research. If that was the case, then we would probably never train, because the majority of research is done on university students, university athletic populations, or untrained university people who just happen to volunteer for a study. It's not done on elite athletes. So if we were relying on research to inform what we do all the time, we would never do anything. So part of evidence-based practice is drawing on the best available research, but it's also taking into account our clinical expertise, our practical experience. And everyone on this call has practical experience. You've got experiences that you've built up on how to problem solve situations. Draw on this experience now. The third part of the evidence-based practice model is your athlete expectations. So your athlete, their expectation of you is, I'm not an expert. They're going to say, I'm not the expert. You're the expert. What's the plan? That's as simple as it's going to be for most of them. And part of that will be, how are we going to prepare for the demands of the sport in the limited time that we've got? So you'll use the best available research, but you're going to have to draw on your practical experience, your clinical expertise, and the athlete expectations to come up with your best evidence-based practice model. Another question that came up was, how does a COVID break, how does the break that comes from COVID-19 compare to a break following off season? And the reality is, hopefully you've seen here, it's actually not that different. Sure, we've got some different challenges that we're faced with, in that we can't train out our high performance facilities, but there is some positives to come from it. We've got some time, and we've got the opportunity to be ready to go at short notice because we've got that time. If we have our athletes buying into their performance, it is their performance, so they will maintain some chronic load. The only thing we don't know is when the gun's going to go off. So once the gun goes off, we want to make sure that we're ready. In order to give our athletes the best chance of being ready, they need to be mentally healthy, they need to be happy, they need to be comfortable within their own skin, and they need to be maintaining some loading. That's our best opportunity. In terms of in terms of the return to sport process, there's a question here about, with all the technology that is available today, should I rely on my gut feeling, or should I rely on data, or should I use both when I'm returning an athlete to sport? Well, again, if we use the North American example, where you have the challenge of not being able to monitor your athletes when they're in off season, or at least using technology, at least using wearables, then the wearable isn't going to help you much. So in that instance, you're going to have to develop some sort of relationship with your athlete where you stay in contact with them. You pick up the phone and you have a conversation. When they come back to your training facility for the start of training camp, then you check in on their tissue health. So you might have some little tests of local tissue capacity. You might have a test of sport-specific capacity, whatever that is for your sport. But one of the things that I think are even stronger than a lot of the tests sometimes is, if you have an honest relationship with your athletes, is just ask them the question: have you been loading? What kind of training have you been doing? Are you ready to train today based on what you've been doing? So there's always going to be a data component of what we do, but there's a whole heap of data that we collect on a day-to-day basis that cannot go into a spreadsheet. And that's the conversations that we have with our athletes, or about our athletes, that help inform the decision-making process. So my answer to that is, where possible, you want to try and use a bit of both. But in a lot of examples, you're going to have to use your expertise, your intuitive expertise, and you're going to have to develop a relationship with your athletes where there's a mutual trust there. The last question on this page is what's a good alternative to the 10% rule in returning someone to sport? Well, a lot of these rules aren't actually rules. Okay, so if we had someone who had a chronic load of 1,000 meters, and we needed them to get to a 10,000 meter race, and we only progressed their load by 10% each week, it would take us 26 weeks to get to that. So clearly, 10% rule doesn't tell us enough. Just loading 10% on top of the next 10% doesn't tell us enough. What we need to have a better understanding of is capacity to handle load. So if you have done no loading, and for a 2-year period, then maybe 10% increases is reasonable. If you're at the ceiling of your capacity, then there's no way you're going to be able to add 10% on top of that. So we need to know the capacity of our athlete to handle load. Some athletes will handle much greater than 10% increases in load if they've got a decent capacity. If they've been training regularly, you're more likely to handle that. But load monitoring, load management, optimal loading is never, ever about one variable, and it's never, ever just about load. So in order for us to know whether where an athlete is ready to load again or tolerating the load, then we need to check the response. So we load an athlete, and it could be as simple as, how did you feel the next day? How did you feel in the 48 hours post? Now, if that athlete is still sore 3 days later, or is experiencing some pain in places they should be experiencing pain, or experiencing more pain than is usual or expected, then that's when we decide whether we're going to load again or we're going to adjust the program. Now, if we adjust the program, it doesn't necessarily mean that we stop loading altogether. It could mean that that athlete needs just a little bit of extra soft tissue work. It might mean they need a bit of extra activation. Or our third option is we either reduce load when we load them again, or we add a little bit of extra recovery. So whenever we load, it's never about one variable. And when I'm talking about one variable, I'm talking about any single variable. It's never about one single variable. We always need to load and then check the response to load before we decide whether we're going to load again. I might just throw to Heath to see whether any other questions came through. Otherwise, we can come back to the questions from earlier in the webinar.
Yeah, great. So, like Tim said earlier, we'll be around for a little bit to answer some questions. I know there's 3 questions we've got that have come through already. So we'll go through and answer some of those ones first. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to submit those as well. So the first one, Ben asked, I think back when we first started answering questions sort of about loading at home, Ben asked, what would be the best way to monitor the intensity of workouts at home? Would you use something like Session RPE, or is there a better tool for you to use to monitor load at home?
Realistically, I think that's the best option we've got, Ben. When you looked at that, every athlete is going to, some will have wearables, some won't. I think if you want to monitor load and what your athletes are doing, then Session RPE is probably the one that allows you to capture a whole heap of different sessions. Now, keep in mind that 1,000 units of Session RPE load are not created equally. So you could get, let's say, if you did a hard weight session for 60 minutes, that's 300 units of load. But that's a completely different load from a hard running session for 60 minutes, which is still 300 units of load, but one's potentially anabolic, one is potentially catabolic. So you still need to try and get a feel for what your athlete is doing across that period. If you have an American football player who gets 3,000 units of Session RPE load in a week, in a normal training week that involves American football training practice plus weight training plus some football specific conditioning, but then they clock up 3,000 units of load in road runs in isolation, then that's a completely different type of load. So you still need to look inside your data to look at how they're accruing that load. And that's where the specificity principle comes in. You still want to try and accrue the load as specifically as possible. Just because it's an opportunity to train doesn't mean that we fill up our training with junk. And that's something that we need to be mindful of with our athletes as well. That some athletes will be so keen to use this as an opportunity to get better that they actually overdo things that they don't need to do. So we might have some strength power athletes that are just overdoing aerobic work. They're creating fatigue, but not in a game-specific way.
Yeah, great. So another really good question we got, I think there's a really interesting one, is if you're in a context where you're working with an athlete who had an injury prior to the shutdown, how do you go about a rehabilitation or reconditioning process in this period for an athlete that's already injured?
Look, the general principle is going to be the same, whether they're in lockdown or whether they're in a high performance facility. There's some things that we need to do. We need to restore local tissue capacity, and we also need to maintain sport specific capacity. We need to restore movement patterns and movement control. We also need to build chronic load, and then we also need to restore sport specific skills. So these principles are going to be the same whether you're injured in lockdown or injured in the high performance facility. All you need to do is think about those general concepts. We want to build local tissue capacity, maintain sport specific capacity, restore our movement qualities, build chronic load where we can and within the limits of biological healing, and if we can, restore sport-specific skills.
Okay, so were there any other questions from the audience that are coming through? If anyone else had any other questions about building resilience or training activities we can do to load at home, or perhaps the actual mechanics of returning to sport, now's a good chance to send those in.
There was one question, Heath, around tissue-specific loading. So when I talk about tissue-specific loading versus energy system loading, there's different tissues will respond differently to load. So, for example, we know that if we spike acute loads, that tendons don't respond very well to acute spikes in load. Bones, on the other hand, an acute spike for them, the injuries tend to sneak up on athletes. So if you've had a low career load and then you have a medium-term spike, so a spike over possibly a 2 to 3 week or maybe a month period, where you've increased your load dramatically over a low career load, then that might increase your risk of bone stress injuries. Joint injuries, they're ones that tend to happen on the back of very high loads over a long period of time. So you'll see that some athletes who have played and trained their whole life and never had an injury, they tend to pick up a few joint injuries towards the back end of their career. One of the things we do know about higher chronic loads, if we can build to higher chronic loads, it tends to be protective against muscle injuries. So one thing to keep in mind is that if you do have an athlete injured, and let's say we've got a bone stress injury, we still want to maintain sport-specific capacity, but there's going to be some things that you cannot do in order to maintain or build sport-specific capacity or build chronic load. In terms of loading, you've got to think about not only bone loading, but not only energy system loading in terms of building back aerobic fitness or strength, but also think about there's a limited amount of load that the bone can handle, for example, in different periods or different phases of recovery. The final question that came through was from Paul. And actually, there's a few other questions that have come through just now. But Paul was talking about hamstring injuries and why hamstring injuries recur a lot. And he said, "Is it a problem with the rehab process, or is it a problem with the competition?" Now, the reality is, when you have an athlete who's a chronic rehabber who continues to break down, typically what happens is, and this is one of the problems that I see commonly in sport, is that the medical team will point the finger at the strength and conditioning specialist and say, "You trained them too hard." And the strength and conditioning coach will say, "No, you actually didn't train them hard enough." And the reality is they're both probably right. The load that you can handle is relative to where you've been. And you need to think of it in terms of looking forward and also looking back. So in terms of optimizing that process, I think if we can think of the return to play process in terms of smaller chunks, so we have an early rehab stage, and then we have a reconditioning phase, and then we have a return to competition phase. If we skip the reconditioning phase and go straight from early rehab to return to play or return to peak performance, where the gap between the floor and the ceiling is too great. So one of the key components of a successful rehab is when you have your sports med and performance team working together and communicating in the process. The sports med team are looking forward. What am I getting this athlete back for? The sports performance team are looking back. Where has this athlete come from? When you have that communication going well, that gives you the best chance of a successful return to peak performance.
So we've got quite a few questions coming in, Tim. If you've got time for a few more, we might.
Maybe we'll take 3 more questions, maybe, or.
Yeah, we can do that. I suppose for anyone else, if we don't get around to your question, feel free to shoot through an email or a message, and we can sort of take some of those offline a little bit. A good question from Sean then asked about using heart rate variability for someone waking up as an indicator for holistic load or for stress. Have you done any sort of, have you heard much about using that as a tool to use to manage load and stress?
Look, heart rate variability is it's an internal load measure, so it won't be it'll be like any other variable in that you on its own. It won't give you all of the information you need. There are some people who found it quite useful in terms of identifying when an athlete might be overtraining relative to the plan. Again, though, it's probably best suited when you can marry up that information with some sort of external load. So if you have the load performed and then you have heart rate variability taken on a regular basis, that might actually be more I think that'd be more beneficial than just taking heart rate variability on its own. And you have to take it on a regular basis. So if you just took snapshots once a month, for example, it wouldn't be enough.
On a similar note, on the issue of understanding loads, when you're working with athletes, how do you go about educating them on loads and understanding for their benefit what overloading looks and feels like for them? Is there any approaches you have to talking to your athletes and educating them on that sort of issue?
Yeah, great question. Look, I think this is a really big part of the monitoring process that is often skipped. That we don't educate our athletes. If we ask them to do session RPEs or well-beings, we don't actually educate them enough around what a hard session should look and feel like, or how their body should feel after a hard session and how it should feel after a recovery session. And if we don't take the time to educate them on those things, then we shouldn't be too surprised that we see sort of garbage responses in some of the questionnaires and our monitoring that we do. If we think of a young athlete and they've never trained before, or compare them with someone who's had 5 years of training experience, both the same age, it shouldn't be too surprising to see the athlete who hasn't trained before, everything that they do is the hardest thing they've ever done in their life, because they've got nothing to anchor it against. They've got nothing to compare it against. So I think a large part of the training monitoring process comes back to educating our athletes around what an easy session should feel like, what a hard session should feel like, but equally, not only learning about monitoring and those numbers, but just learning about how to train themselves. A lot of athletes, young athletes, aren't really athletes because they've never really learned how to train. So a big part of that is educating them around the training process. the discipline around preparing for the training process. And the more they learn around that, the more they learn their own body, the more they learn what they need to do in order to train well and compete well. That's where I think we're in a better situation to get good data from
them. So we've got another question, which I think is quite an interesting one. I think it ties together a lot of the themes you've just sort of mentioned. So this is from Takaaki, and he asks, is there any sort of tools you use to measure regularly to monitor if a load is adequate for an athlete? So heart rate, body weight, blood pressure, tiredness. He sort of mentioned a lot of those indicators. It sounds very similar to that training spreadsheet that we have that sort of tracks down your physical load and your response to that load. Do you want to sort of talk about those sort of indicators and the tools you'd use for that?
Yeah, look, it sort of comes back to the question around optimal loading is not just about load. So we need to check the response to load. So here's an example of how this might look. So we can have our day-to-day planned versus our actual load. We can work out different sessions, what our actual load looks like in relative to the plan. Now, just because actual load might be higher than the planned load doesn't mean we need to shut our athletes down. The next thing we need to do is track their response to that load. Now, we can do this in a few ways. So we can look at the wellbeing response over days, or we can look at it in terms of weeks. Or on any single day, we can be asking our athletes how they responded to a load. So if we loaded heavy on one day, we bring them back the next, and we can look at their fatigue levels, their sleep, their soreness, their stress, their mood. All of these things are related to overall well-being and whether they're adapting to the load. Now that's more of a long-term response. We can use it as a feedback response. So once we've loaded, we check the response, it determines whether we load again. Or we can use it as a feed-forward response, where if someone comes in and everything that they've rated is well below average, then it indicates whether they're able to handle the session today or not, or whether we need to adjust the session somehow. For example, whether we need to provide a greater active warm-up, some soft tissue work, some extra activation. Now, all of this is tied back to things like having a plan, working out what your weekly load should look like, comparing it against your actual load, and again, just checking the response. If you want to know whether your athlete is responding well to a given load at a particular point in time, though, so this is more of a longer term view. So load, check the response the following day or the following 48 hours. If you want to look at whether you are achieving adequate adaptation or an adequate stimulus, from a particular session, then you use external load, you manipulate external load up or down to achieve that. So if you want to achieve an RPE of 8 and the external load is too low, then you just manipulate the external load up to achieve that. Or if you want to achieve a heart rate of 90% of heart rate max and you're only at 70%, then the thing that you can change is external load. You can change it up or down in session to achieve the desired stimulus. And that's the idea behind we look at external and internal loads during the session, but that alone won't tell you whether someone is coping or tolerating with the session long term. We have to check the longer term response, and that's where we plan, we load, we check the actual load, we check the response, and we can do that very simply through our wellbeing questionnaires or any other of the internal load measures, for example, heart rate variability measures that we can take.
That was great, Tim. Look, we've got a couple other questions if you want to keep going, or we might wrap up there and take some of those offline.
Yeah, well, maybe we just take 5 more minutes to wrap up, and then because I'm sure some people are listening in, like, and it's 2 a.m. wherever they are. So I appreciate you hanging in there for the ones who've signed in from Europe.
Okay, so maybe
So maybe,
let's wrap up with one more question.
yeah, one last question. Huh?
Okay, so this one's quite an interesting one, I think, very topical. Kiara's sort of asked about the impact on this shutdown of sports on the Olympics. So that's obviously been postponed. How do you think the athletes that were supposed to participate in the Olympics will go about, preparing for, say, next year, or if it's maybe postponed even further? How do they reach the load that they were at? Do they maintain the load for an entire year? How do you think that plays out? What sort of questions would you be asking? What sort of recommendations would you be making if you were in that situation?
Yeah, well, we're actually in this situation at the moment. There's a few scenarios. So there's two answers. One is there's some athletes who were seeing 2020 as the finish line, and they were they were getting to the end of the career, and 2020 was their swan song. That was going to be the end for them. So they've got to decide whether, okay, now I'm just going to retire and that's it for me, or can I hang on for another year? Can I do another lap? And that in itself is going to create a huge psychological challenge for some athletes, whether they have to, like, an enforced retirement because they just can't see themselves going another year, or whether they've got to get themselves up for another year. Now, in terms of reloading, the benefit we've got here is time. We've got time now. So the athletes who can adapt the quickest are the ones who are going to handle this situation the best. So if you're sitting around on the couch feeling sorry for yourself, eating choc chip cookies, then the longer you do that for, the longer it's going to take you to adapt, the longer it's going to take you to get your mind around head around the fact that it's still game on. We've got some competition coming up in the year. So if you can adapt to that quickly, give yourself some downtime to recover, and then get yourself back into a routine. There's no race to build up to the high chronic loads that you were at, you know, at around at this time. You've got time to build up to those loads. And you might, depending on the time you've got, you might look at a double peak. So you build up to high chronic loads, give yourself an unloading period or a maintenance period, build up to another peak, and then taper leading into the Olympics. Every sport is going to deal with it differently, but I really believe that the athletes who can adapt mentally to it are the ones who are going to and get their head around the fact that, all right, this is it's just the finish line has moved a little bit. The ones who can adapt to that are the ones who are going to succeed in the Olympics.
Look, I think that's a great answer, Tim. So I'd just like to sort of reiterate what you were saying before. Big thanks to everyone who came along. I know it's tricky with the time zone sometimes to get it to work for everyone. It was relatively early morning for us here in Australia. I know for our American friends it was sort of around dinner time, and people tuning in from Europe probably stayed up very late into the night to come along. So we really appreciate everyone coming along. If you are interested in learning more, Tim does do a few online courses. A lot of these are still available during this time, and we've got a live online course coming up in June that is still fully accredited. So if you need your CEUs, that's a good course to come along to. We'll send out an email with the details to the attendees in case that's something you're interested in. Great opportunity to learn further about this topic. But once again, thanks very much for coming, and we'll wrap up there. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone, for coming along. Really hope you enjoyed it, and all the best with your training. Thanks very much for your support.